This video is a supplemental lecture that is meant to expand upon some material that is covered in the lecture entitled The Function Argument, and you can find a link to that video in the description section below. In Chapter 7, Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives us a definition of what it means to achieve eudaimonia, or true human flourishing. Eudaimonia, he tells us, is the activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Because Aristotle believes human flourishing must concern something which is distinctively human, something not shared by any other animal, it may not surprise us that he believes the good human life is a life guided by reason. However, Aristotle does not just claim that we should follow reason in a general sense. Rather, it is the activities of the soul in particular that must be guided by reason. But what does Aristotle take the soul to be? How does our soul act? What does it do? And of course, what does it mean to guide the actions of our soul by reason? Or for that matter, what would it mean to fail to guide our soul by reason? In this video, we will consider each of these questions in order to gain a more complete understanding of Aristotle's conception of human happiness. In the course of defining the nature of human flourishing, Aristotle eliminates the possibility that it is a life of nourishment and growth or a life of mere sentience. And he eliminates both of these possibilities because each of these things are shared with other sorts of living things and consequently are not unique to the human species. However, in Aristotle's view, whatever it means for a human being to flourish must be something that distinguishes the human species from any other animal. The remaining possibility, which Aristotle accepts, is that our flourishing is concerned with a life concerned with the element that possesses reason. But an element of what? Well, the answer is the human soul. So this means that a flourishing human life is concerned primarily with the element of the human soul that possesses reason. And furthermore, Aristotle tells us that the element that possesses reason has two parts. On the one hand, there's the part of the soul that obeys or listens to reason, and on the other hand, there's the part that does the reasoning and engages in thought. This means that our human flourishing is not only concerned with the part of the soul directly responsible for actively engaging in reasoning. It also has to do with the part of the soul that is responsible for just listening to and obeying reason. To better understand this, we need to examine some of the further claims Aristotle makes about the soul in chapter 13 of Book 1. Of course, there are many different ideas about what the soul is, but in Aristotle's view, most fundamentally, the soul is that which separates living from non-living things. Living things with souls will be capable of a whole range of activities that beings without souls cannot do. This includes nutrition, growth, locomotion, sensation, and thought, among other things. However, since these abilities do not exist in all living beings, for example, a plant can take in nutrients and grow, but it cannot engage in locomotion or experience sensations. And because that is the case, the soul of all living things will not be exactly the same. There are parts of the human soul that will not be possessed by plants and, in addition, other animal species. For our purposes, the main point here is that the human soul, in some sense, can be divided into parts. The first division we can make, according to Aristotle, is between an element of the soul that has reason and another element of the soul that does not have reason. There is a rational part, responsible for thinking, as well as a non-rational part that is responsible for everything that occurs without thought. If what Aristotle said previously about the human function is true, that is, if it is true that the characteristic activity of the human being is activity of the soul in accordance with reason, then that means that our human function will largely have to do with the rational part of the soul. However, the matter is not quite that simple. This is because we should also remember that Aristotle thinks our human function has to do with a part of the soul that is obedient to reason or follows reason, and not only the part of the soul that does the reasoning. Therefore, we will also need to examine the non-rational part of the soul. The non-rational part of the soul itself can also be further divided. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses two of these non-rational parts of the soul, the vegetative part of the soul and the appetitive part of the soul. The vegetative part is responsible for the operations of nutrition and growth, the operations of taking in and utilizing energy from the environment to sustain the body. These operations are shared by humans, animals, and plants. And as we would expect, Aristotle again emphasizes that because these operations are not unique to human beings, the characteristic activity of the human being cannot deal with this part of the soul. In fact, if the human function dealt with this part of the soul, it would be nearly impossible to tell the difference between a good and bad person. That is because these operations are essentially the same in everyone, regardless of their moral character, and they even function when we are asleep. And of course, during sleep, there is really no way to differentiate between those who are virtuous and those who are vicious. On this point, Aristotle cites the saying that the happy are no different from the wretched for half their lives. For these reasons, the vegetative part of the soul plays no role in human virtue. However, the role that the appetitive part of the soul plays in virtue is more complicated. This part of the soul deals with appetite and desire. This is the part of the soul which is responsible for the strong desires we have for a whole range of things. For example, we want food and drink and sex and all manner of different pleasures. We also want to express our anger, have our resentments recognized, and avoid danger. These operations do not occur in plants, however, we do share many of these with other animals. The crucial thing to know about the appetitive soul is this: it stands as a sort of middle ground between the rational part of the soul and the vegetative soul in terms of its responsiveness to reason. To see this point, consider whether the vegetative soul could respond to the commands of reason. To take one example, consider the operation of growth. When we are young, we take in energy from the environment by eating, and some of this is used to grow our bodies. Now imagine that using your reason, you determined that you had already reached a sufficiently tall height and you didn't want to grow any taller. Of course, you could accomplish this by undereating and stunting your growth, but imagine you tried to do so by commanding your body to stop growing. By saying to your body, after due consideration, I have determined through the use of my reason that there is no need for me to get any taller, so I command you to stop growing. Obviously, this would not work, and the reason it would not work is because the operations of nutrition and growth do not listen to reason. We cannot reason our body out of growth, metabolism, and many other natural bodily functions. However, the same cannot be said of the appetitive soul. It is true that the appetitive part of the soul is non-rational. That is, the appetitive soul does not actively engage in reason and thought. Furthermore, many of the desires we have appear in us whether we like it or not, whether we think those desires are reasonable or unreasonable. We cannot reason ourselves out of desiring food or water, and even something like the desire to be lazy and shirk our responsibilities comes upon us without our permission. At the same time, these desires can be controlled through our reason to some extent. Suppose you have already had one piece of cake and immediately you desire another piece. You might give in to this desire and take another piece, but also you might not. In fact, you might be able to convince yourself that it is not a good idea by going through some process of thought and reasoning. For instance, you might say, I've already had one piece and I've been trying to have a healthier diet and get in shape, and I told myself I was only going to have one, and if I break my promise to myself now, my resolve to stick to my diet will definitely be weakened later on. Furthermore, the additional pleasure I will get from a second piece of cake will not be significantly greater than the pleasure I already gained from the first piece. It is at least possible that through such a process of reasoning, you might be able to resist the temptation you feel to have another slice of cake. More generally, it is possible, even if it is difficult, to control the desires of our appetite of soul through reason. This is why Aristotle tells us that this part of the soul, while non rational, partakes of reason. Specifically, in the self controlled person, this element of the soul obeys reason. To make this point clear, Aristotle uses the following comparison. The appetitive part of the soul has reason in the sense that a person who listens to the reason of his father and his friends is said to have reason. Let's return to our previous example. Suppose you were considering whether to have that second piece of cake, but a friend who you previously asked to help you remain accountable to your diet advises you not to do so by listing all the reasons why it would be a bad idea. In this case, we might say it would be a reasonable or rational choice to listen to your friend's advice. Of course, you might ultimately reject that person's advice. They can't force you to do anything. But listening to their counsel would be a wise decision. Aristotle sees the relationship between the rational soul and the appetitive soul in the same way. The desires of the appetitive soul may spring up in us without us reflecting upon them or reasoning about them. However, unlike the operations of the vegetative soul, these desires can be controlled by reason and are responsive to our rational processes of thought. So, what does all this tell us about the characteristic activity of the human being? Recall that Aristotle believes our characteristic activity is activity of the soul in accordance with reason. This is an activity that has to do both with the reasoning part of the soul, the rational soul, as well as the part of the soul that obeys reason, the appetitive soul. Given this, we can say that a properly functioning and ultimately happy human being is able to properly control her appetites, desires, and instincts through reason. Aristotle will have much more to say about how this is done and about how we train ourselves to do this in Book 2. There we will see that while Aristotle does not advocate completely suppressing our desires and instincts, he does think that we become virtuous by using our reason to ensure that these are expressed in the right way, at the right time, in the right circumstance, and in the right amount. However, for the moment, we should note how this distinguishes human beings from other species of animal. In Aristotle's view, other animal species act purely from instinct. Because they lack a higher rational nature, an animal can only follow its natural instincts and its actions. Of course, human beings have many natural instincts and desires as well. However, unlike animals, the human being can control these through reason. We might naturally desire to avoid danger, but through the use of our reason, we can see that certain situations require fighting this desire and facing danger with courage. We might naturally desire to eat too much or drink too much, but our reason tells us that doing so will be harmful in the long run. This is why moral virtue requires controlling our appetitive soul through our rational soul. This is why Aristotle says that the self-controlled, temperate, and brave person is the person who is ready to listen to reason and is in total harmony with reason. Thus, the person who fulfills the characteristic activity of the human being is the person who controls her passions and desires through her reason and pursues these desires in the right way, at the right time, in the right amount, and ultimately in the right circumstance.